Okay. Does that mean I can start?
I think so.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this virtual book talk with author Stephanie Kim. Very thrilled to have her and really liked her book. This talk with the author is co-sponsored. It's sponsored by the Center for Studies in Higher Ed, but we also have a co-sponsorship by the Berkeley School of Education, the Institute of East Asian Studies, and the Center for Korean Studies as well. And Stephanie has a long-term association with the Center for Korean Studies when she was here on the Berkeley campus for a period. So the book is Constructing Student Mobility, How Universities Recruit Students and Shape Pathways Between Berkeley and Seoul, which was published by MIT's press here in 2023. So you can look online on Amazon or wherever if you'd like to get a copy. Stephanie is Associate Professor of Practice, Faculty Director of Higher Education Administration as part of Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. She has a BA from Michigan and an NYU MS in Global Studies, and then finally a PhD in education from UCLA is when I met her, and she was down at UCLA working with Johns Hawkins, who's a mutual colleague and who has passed away since, but was really a great person. And I just wanted to shout out to him and how much we enjoyed working with him. So the format is discussion oriented. I'm going to ask a number of questions to Stephanie, and she's got a short PowerPoint as well to do some summaries about the book, but you're welcome to provide some questions in the chat box, and I'll try to integrate where I can. And so I just want to say a couple of things about the book that I observed and enjoyed. One is that she really gets into this dual dynamics of not only families and their students and how they're trying to look at global, mobilization, moving from place to place and being international students, but also on the institutional side, the universities and what they're doing. And I think this is all important and has some aspects that we need to realize is that, again, in most of Asia and in Korea, there's a shrinking population, and with too many higher ed institutions there, that's going to have some kind of collapse, I guess. And there are reform movements which she talks about in it. But she also looks at the different sides of the equation in terms of how students experience not only where they are at a place like Berkeley, but also within the international student community, which I thought was very, very interesting and learned a lot. And she does this, as she probably will talk about, with some personal stories of students, or Jessica, Audrey, and Yuri. And so that's a very interesting dynamic that I had not, I maybe suspected it, but I didn't quite understand it the way that she explores it. She also kind of goes through this fraught relationships of international students. Oh, I already said that with their own community. But the last thing I wanted to say was this other concept that she discusses, which is elusiveness of home. And the students are between various cultures. And I will say, I think what's very interesting is the cover of her book kind of gives that sense. It looks a little bit like Lost in Translation. So if you know the movie, which was kind of focused on some themes that relate to some degree. So now to the question that I pose to Stephanie is, why did you write this book?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you inviting me to give this talk with the center. Thank you also, Shan, for helping to coordinate, and thank you to all the co-sponsors for supporting it. So to answer your question, I wrote this book because of a funny incident that happened to me when I was working at UC Berkeley. So I worked there for 4 years after I completed my PhD. As John mentioned, I worked at the Center for Korean Studies as the program director. And there's one semester when I was invited to give a guest lecture for a Korean Studies class. And the lecture was supposed to be about the significance of education to South Korean society. And a lot of the students in this class were actually international students from South Korea. So I gave my lecture on the extreme competition in the South Korean education system. And then afterwards, the students shared personal stories of coming up through this very system. They studied at cram schools, or they might have done early study abroad or so forth before they arrived at Berkeley. And then I asked the students a kind of provocative question. Did these experiences help you get into Berkeley? And the class got really quiet, except for one student. And this student did not like my question at all. She made that very clear to me. And she insisted that she had worked really hard and had earned her place at Berkeley. So then I asked her, well, okay, well, what differentiated her from any other student who I presume also earned their place? And she snapped back at me, I'm not one of those rich international students. Now, we've all heard stereotypes about rich international students in the US, and a lot of these stereotypes have been advanced through the popular culture we consume. So, for example, films like Crazy Rich Asians. But it's also been advanced through the scholarly literature from the last 2 decades. So it begins with the notion of flexible citizenship, which is what the anthropologist Aiwo Ong put forward in 1999, that essentially argues that individuals reposition their citizenship as a proactive strategy to accumulate more wealth and power. But this idea continues with more recent studies on international students, which often frames their pursuit of study abroad as a kind of aspiration, as these affluent and uninhibitedly global individuals move across borders to pursue their college education. But this idea of the rich international student really took a hold for me, because it wasn't just a label that an American student was using to describe an international student, but it was actually a label that a Korean student studying at Berkeley was using to describe other Korean students at Berkeley. And this indicated to me that there was a lot more going on than simply these mobile individuals pursuing a college education abroad. So with that, I'm just going to briefly share my screen. I don't have very complex PowerPoint slides, but it's just to give you a little bit of more of a visual as I'm talking. So, essentially this small moment led me to a much bigger project about the role of universities in shaping international student mobility. So I'm a higher education scholar. I'm also an institutional ethnographer. So I was really interested in contextualizing the international student experience within the larger university that they attend. So because of this small moment, I started this project when I was working at Berkeley. And of course, Berkeley is where a sizable proportion of international students come from South Korea. When I was there, I was interviewing Korean students. I interviewed also Korean students at neighboring community colleges. I attended school events, visited student clubs. I poured through student newspapers and online forums. And in the book, I essentially show how the California higher education system reconfigured its community college transfer system into an unexpected international admissions pipeline into Berkeley for mostly Korean students. And what happened was that this novel pipeline then created these complex forms of intra-ethnic othering, where Korean students would refer to other Korean students as those rich international students, even though they were all international students at Berkeley. And I should point out that South Korea is the third largest sender of international students to the US, but actually per capita, it's the largest. So it sends 3 times more students than China and 6 times more students than India when you adjust for population. And this is why I focus on Korean students specifically in the book. So in the book, I started out with my project at Berkeley, but I brought in a comparative dimension to this. And I also examined Yonsei University, which is a university in South Korea. And it's widely considered the most global university in the country, especially because it opened an international college. And this international college is essentially an American-style liberal arts college housed inside a Korean university. So I had spent a year affiliated with Yonsei as a Fulbright scholar. When I was there, I conducted an institutional ethnography of its international college. I interviewed students as well, faculty members, administrative leaders. I generally immersed myself in the daily life of the university. I took classes, I attended school events, and so forth. And what I found were these really unexpected but fascinating parallels to what I had found at Berkeley. That in the book, I show how Yonsei reconfigured its international college into an unexpected admissions pipeline for mostly Korean students who might have studied abroad in the United States, but instead chose to enroll at this international college as a kind of domestic alternative to studying abroad. And then this novel pipeline then created similarly complex forms of intra-ethnic othering, where Korean students would refer to other Korean students as quote unquote foreign students, even though they all shared the same Korean citizenship. So that was essentially how the book started, was me looking at these two universities, UC Berkeley and Yonsei University. But over time, as I was drafting some of the early chapters, I realized that there was an important piece missing from my book. I mean, I was looking at the universities and the students who attend them, but I was also realized that there are these multitude of actors that broker that relationship in between universities and students. And so I added another piece to this project. So I also examined all these ancillary people and organizations that make up this much larger industry of global higher education. And I use the word industry quite broadly to include both, of course, the for-profit education industry and various not-for-profit and governmental activities as well. So I spent a year at the very beginning of the pandemic profiling and interviewing individuals who work in this larger global higher education industry. I interviewed people like education agents who help Korean students get into universities and also get paid a commission for doing so. I interviewed admissions recruiters who are contracted by California community colleges and who manage the college's relationships with education agents. I connected with people who work in international high schools in South Korea that essentially groom students to study in the United States, as well as people who work in various other parts of this industry. So people who work in quasi-regulatory bodies like NACAC, or people who work in governmental agencies like the State Department. And in the book, I map out how all these different stakeholders fit together. And I ultimately show how these external actors become an extension of university student recruitment efforts, even though they may not actually have a formal affiliation with the university. And they ultimately help ensure that this global student supply chain runs smoothly as they funnel students from to either one university or another. And so the larger argument that I make in my book is that universities, not necessarily the students, are the ones who create the paths that allow students to be internationally mobile in the first place. And by focusing on these two universities, Berkeley and Yonsei, both of which aggressively sought out international students after the global financial crisis, I show that even though these universities are geographically, culturally, and linguistically miles apart and operating in completely different contexts, I mean, one is, of course, within a receiving country and the other is an ascending country, they still sought out students in these similarly flexible and market-driven ways. And that is how we can understand these international student mobility flows around the world. And, just up from a personal level, the book is a culmination of over a decade of research. So, I've hinted at this before, but, I started this project when I was a doctoral student. I continued it when I worked as a postdoc and then an administrative staff member, and finally finished it when I became a professor. So in addition to the ethnographic analyses, a lot of the book is also complemented by my own firsthand insights of studying and working in higher education and in these various different roles, and being completely immersed in the day-to-day life of these campuses. And so the larger goal of my book is to offer a different way of understanding international students, not by focusing on the students per se, but instead by focusing on what's happening in the universities. Because the way international students are often framed as a kind of financial impetus by universities profoundly impacts their daily experiences on campus. And so we can't ignore that interplay between international student recruitment logics and the international student experience, because it highlights how students' lives are essentially inseparable from the organizational behaviors of the universities that brought them there in the first place. So what I'll do now is stop here, because I just wanted to give a very high-level overview of the book. And I'm happy to jump into a conversation with you, John.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So, one thing that was very interesting and among many things, the observation was the number of South Korean students that do go to California community colleges. And then, as you know, if I have that accurate, the majority of South Korean undergraduate students at Berkeley went to a community college first, if I had that right. But in any case, it's really an interesting ability and knowledge about how to navigate the system. And I guess it relates to this growth of, of various agents and people paying money for advice. But how did they figure that out? And also, it's just a remarkable number. So just a general question, how could they figure out how to navigate that?
Yeah. Well, just to clarify the earlier point you made, it's not that the majority of South Korean students at Berkeley or in the UC system went to community colleges first. It's that, at least for a time, of the international students who did, South Korea was actually the largest demographic, at least for a time. It's changed more recently, but certainly during this during the critical period of the 2010s, when community colleges became a kind of known international student pathway, they did constitute the largest demographic.
And just to add, because they had to figure out which, there are certain ones that are feeders to UC. There's about 10 or so. And so you have to, they're Santa Monica, De Anza, and these others that are in more wealthy neighborhoods, but they'd also have to figure out that part of the equation.
Yeah. It's a combination of a number of different things. It's certainly marketed on the part of community colleges that that tout the high transfer rates from their community college into a UC institution such as Berkeley. I mean, that's very much part of the community college's marketing strategy. That marketing strategy is then relayed to education agents who operate overseas. And those are, and this is a very conscious, intentional decision. And those education agents, which are, not employees, but essentially contractors with colleges, they're the ones working also with students and to relay this information that where they help the students, even identify these pathways and provide recommendations and help them navigate it. And of course, the agents get paid both on the side of the students for helping them for their services, and they also get paid a commission from the colleges for bringing in a certain number of students.
Okay, well, it is an amazing transformation over time. Another question that is often asked, and you do to discuss this extensively in the book is, where are those cultural elements in South Korea, that are driving so many students? Well, one, we know that they have among the highest post-secondary education participation rates in the world among them, and completion rates as well. And there's something about Confucius ideology or cultural aspects in Asia that drive that. But what are the dynamics of the South Korean world, and how does that differ from other parts of Asia, like China, for example?
Yeah. So, I mean, on one hand, there is this strong, broad dedication to the pursuit of education. Many people have observed this, written about it, and so forth. And that's not unique to South Korea per se. But I think South Korea can be considered a much more extreme example of this. So, for example, among the OECD countries, South Korea actually has the highest higher education attainment rate among the 25 to 34-year-olds. So 70% of 25 to 34-year-olds complete higher education. And that's the highest rate in the world. I mean, if you, just for sake of comparison, here in the US, that rate is approximately 51%, around that point. So but what also makes South Korea stand out a bit more than some of its neighboring countries is that it is the rate at which so many students go abroad. So I mentioned earlier, if you look at the per capita rate of students going abroad, there are many, many more students go abroad from Korea than they do from China or India. And obviously, from absolute numbers, China and India just have bigger populations. But this is just the rate of students who leave South Korea to pursue their education. And it's not just at the higher education level, it is also even at the primary and secondary education level. So many times a student might pursue early study abroad in elementary school or middle school. So leaving South Korea to pursue education has become a kind of normalized practice within the country, starting from as early as elementary school all the way up to the higher education level. So in that sense, just thinking about, the extreme competition for education, the extreme educational attainment, and also the extreme rates of going abroad, it really does stand out as this kind of outlier in comparison. And that's what makes it such a unique category to think through these questions of the international student experience, because in many ways, Koreans have become the ultimate international students since they're going overseas at such high rates.
You think that will continue over time? You discuss in the book, and I've read some about various reforms going on in South Korea. One is trying to, everybody wants to go to Seoul. That is like the Paris kind of phenomena, the city center that seems to gather all the talent. Trying to create more options locally. You talk at Yancy about having more of an American curriculum. Some courses are taught in English, these kinds of things. But that big factor is, of course, laying out there is population decline and other kinds of factors. So thinking of all those different variables, do you think that the flow of South Korean students will to the US, California, or other parts of the world, because it's becoming more competitive, it's sometimes cheaper, quality is improving in Singapore and other places? Sorry, long, but how do you think this is going to play out over the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, well, we've already seen it decline. So the number of South Korean students coming to the US has been steadily declining year over year. There are a number of reasons for this, and John, you touched on a lot of important ones. Of course, demographic decline being one of them. There are just fewer young people in South Korea. But that also fuels a few different things. So because of demographic decline, the South Korean government has become much more aggressive about instituting certain policies and reforms that would then retain domestic student outflow. So preventing students who might have gone to the US and having them stay within South Korea. So by offering things like an American style liberal arts college, but housed inside a Korean university, these kinds of, much more extreme measures in many ways than we might see in other places. So to answer your question, we are already seeing, a kind of plateauing and now steady decrease in the number of Korean students leaving. But it's not just the demographic decline, it's the demographic decline compounded with the government measures to intentionally keep students within the country.
Are they going to other places as well now, or more diverse places in Asia which many programs now do teach in English, or they have some component of a university that does that? Are they going other places?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that at least for a time before COVID, China was becoming an increasingly popular place to study, but not necessarily for degree seekers, but primarily for exchange programs, for language study, and so forth. In terms of students who seek out a degree from an overseas university, by far the United States is the most popular destination overseas.
Okay, let's go back to the kind of cultural experiences that international students have, which is a major component of your book. You have Jessica as a person that you follow over time, and it's very interesting aspects of not only how does the institution view international students and treat them, perhaps. I know there are definitely significant efforts to integrate and support international students, much more so now than, say, a decade or more ago. Institutions are trying to be better about that, I think. But you also talk about these interrelationships within the international student community. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and Jessica's experience.
Yeah, so one of the students whom I profile is Jessica. I've named her Jessica, a pseudonym. And Jessica was a student at UC Berkeley when I met her. She was a political economy major at the time. And she had actually entered UC Berkeley by first attending Danza College as an international student from South Korea, and then transferring into UC Berkeley, which is very much a common pipeline that I've discussed throughout the book. The interesting thing about Jessica is that, she said a lot of things about how, she would lightly conceal the fact that she entered UC Berkeley in this way because it stigmatized her amongst her peers. And by peers, I mean other Korean students at UC Berkeley. So there was this stigma around how students entered the university as a way to create these divisions and tensions. So within the Korean student community at Berkeley, which is quite sizable, oftentimes Korean students would use these labels. They would call themselves freshman student or transfer student, implying the way in which they entered the university. And each label was laden with these class stigmas, with these assumptions behind it. And so that label of the quote unquote rich international student, that was actually deployed to describe transfer students from community colleges. The reason being that the students interpreted their widening access to community colleges versus their narrowing access to enter Berkeley as freshmen as their ability to pay versus their ability to succeed. And I think this is where we can zoom out a bit and then look at, well, why is this very complex form of othering happening within this community? And when we zoom out, it's really because of the way the UC system or the California higher education system has framed the very presence of international students. So a few years ago, I like to share this story. A few years ago, I was at this UC alumni event here in DC, and Janet Napolitano was there. And Napolitano very explicitly said at this event, international students actually increase the UC system's ability to accept more California students because the higher tuition that international students pay subsidizes the tuition of California residents. And essentially, Napolitano's statement shows that the very presence of international students within the UC system had to do with the tuition revenue that they brought in. And maybe there are other auxiliary benefits, but they were secondary to that financial piece of it. And this is essentially what has caused a lot of the tensions. I mean, we get this idea, of course, of the rich international student in our imagination, and that also trickles down to very nuanced tensions in between what may appear on the surface as similar groups of international students. So, for example, international students from South Korea, they also internalize this messaging and create these very complex forms of divisions, of labels, and social cliques and so forth.
Yeah, that was the line that was often used in Sacramento, and not just for international students, but out-of-state students. And there's, this is an ongoing tension throughout the country, as you know. And, there was a deal kind of set to kind of, lower the percentages at Berkeley and UCLA of international. And if I remember correctly, roughly about 8%, 17% of the students that go to UC are out of state at the undergraduate level. And of that, around 8 or something. So it's about half or so is international. So they're not all international students, but UC struck a deal on the budget side to bring that down a little. Anyway, a long way to say that there's been internalized that, well, this is a way to defend this ongoing question of whether they're displacing domestic students. And it was just interesting way that you integrated it more into how it then burbles down into how students perceive themselves, perhaps others do as well. Now, again, your book is really about undergraduate students, but if we look at the profile, there are actually more international students at the graduate level, and there's a different rationale for that. But do you have any observations about international students, Korean or otherwise, at the graduate level? Are there a lot of the dynamics that you talk about similar, or are they different?
Yeah, well, there's a very specific reason why I focus on undergraduate students in the book. It's because when universities turn to international students as primarily sources of revenue, following the financial crisis and the Great Recession, they primarily did turn to undergraduate students because undergraduate students, for the most part, are full fee paying from private sources, whether that's from their family or otherwise. So that
cheaper.
Was an intentional choice.
Cheaper.
Yes. And if you put it in starkly economic terms, that's absolutely true. So historically, prior to that point, international graduate students were sought for as sources of talent, particularly in the STEM fields in doctoral programs. And so, oftentimes universities would pay them a stipend and so forth. So when the rationale changed, that's actually when we saw greater growth among international undergraduate students than graduate students. But you mentioned a great point, John. This year, or this past year, the 21 to 22 academic year was actually an exception in that for the first time in a while, we actually saw more international graduate students than undergraduate students, which was a reversal of the trend we had been seeing for the last 10, 15 years. So does that mean things will change? I don't know for sure. I don't know if that was just a one-year blip or if that portends something much more long-term. I think with that more recent shift in that 1 year, it's because we did see some decline in the number of Chinese students coming to the United States. The majority of Chinese students are studying at the undergraduate level. So that's what caused that slight change in that 1 year.
In the Jessica example, she stays in the U.S. and goes on to get a graduate degree out of the University of Chicago, not a terrible place. And so that was, I was wondering more about the stay rates, because this is also a debate about what are the benefits of bringing international students, and there are other ones that I'm hoping we could get to. But what are their stay rates? Do they go on to graduate school from undergrad? If we were to, again, kind of explore a little bit at the graduate level, are they going into businesses and these kinds of things? Or are they going back? I think you note in the book that most, at least in the past, do go back to South Korea and enter the job market. And, I guess it's still doing pretty well, South Korea, with its various Samsungs and car industries and these kinds of things. But what are the intentions? Has it changed over time, or do you think most South Korean students are still looking to go back? So what are the stay rates like?
Yeah, so in general, for the most part, the South Korean students who come to the United States do return home upon graduation and enter the South Korean job market. The South Korean job market, though, it's actually become not the easiest place to find a job, especially for a young person. So perhaps in a decade or two prior, a UC Berkeley degree would have almost certainly guaranteed a great job for a young college graduate back in South Korea. But that's no longer the case. It's become much more competitive, much more cutthroat. The job market has flooded with many U.S. university degree holders, and so it doesn't necessarily give students a competitive edge. That being said, because it's become so much more precarious for college graduates, this is why, in large part, you see this complex form of othering happen at a place like Berkeley. So because a UC Berkeley degree no longer guarantees a job back home in South Korea, students have tried to scapegoat reasons for this. One of the scapegoats being blaming those who entered Berkeley as community college transfers for, quote unquote, diluting the value of the UC Berkeley degree in the job market back home. And so it's a confluence of these different factors that are creating this very particular kind of story for Jessica and others at Berkeley.
So, looking at the changes in higher ed reforms in South Korea, which I have a little bit of knowledge on, at least I think one of the aspects you talk about, one is the trying to, provide a more of an American style educational program as an alternative. There's this question of how to build up the outside of Seoul regional urban areas and their universities, and which seems logical from an outsider's viewpoint. But also, I think you also point to the rise of a more vocational kind of component of the system that may be feeding better into the labor economy, kind of, I guess, in a bit of a like a Hochschulen, kind of the German model, if I had that correct. So what are those? Why don't you just, for our audience who aren't up on all these kinds of things, what is the changing market or the structure of higher education in South Korea?
Yeah, so for the last 2 decades, there were a lot of investments from the South Korean government to internationalize South Korean universities so that they would also become world-class institutions. And I know, John, you've written a lot about this and also critiqued this logic, of course, too. But the idea being that by transforming South Korean universities into world-class universities, that they would also attract international students from overseas. And that has, for the most part, worked. There have been more international students coming to South Korea. And at the same time, these very internationalized campuses have also begun to re-attract Korean domestic students who might have otherwise studied at a place like UC Berkeley, for example. And so a lot of that was concentrated in the Seoul region, though. So it's also attracted a lot of the students who otherwise come from outside of Seoul to migrate and flock to the universities in Seoul, because that's where a lot of the investment was. That's where the best networks are to find jobs, most of which are concentrated in Seoul. So now there's a newer shift to invest more in some of the regional universities outside of Seoul, in the various provinces, so that they too can become more competitive, not necessarily for international students per se, but perhaps for retaining their local students from the provinces, who otherwise might have flocked to Seoul.
Do you think that's going to work?
You know, if I could answer that question accurately, I'd probably get paid a lot more than I do. If I can, if I can tell, if I can foretell the future of these kinds of things. But I mean, judging from how well a lot of these similar policies have worked for universities in Seoul, yes, in some ways, I think that with heavy and intentional investment in regional universities, I think certainly you can see some pattern shifts.
Kind of related to this is, and maybe you kind of answered this, and I'm not sure in the book, but so how much is South Korea banking on potentially being a hub for the rest of Asia to bring in students? That Japan is attempting to do this. China has done this in a very narrow way with their Belt and Road in their own kind of particular way. But those that have declining populations and South Korea has a tradition of good quality universities. And so how much is that going to play into the future of South Korea's higher ed system?
Yeah, it's already been a part of the national strategy for higher education. I mean, you see this with their free economic zone in Incheon. It's called Songdo. So it's a collection of, it's basically a free economic zone where international branch campuses can set up shop and operate in South Korea. The idea was to have it become an education hub of Asia. And in fact, not too long ago, only just a few weeks ago, the South Korean government unveiled a brand new policy initiative called the 300K initiative, I believe. And the idea is to attract 300,000 international students to South Korea. Previous attempts set the benchmark at 100,000, and then and that benchmark was met. And so now they've upped the ante and said, we want to bring in 300,000.
I think there's a kind of a similar story in Japan with getting this broad announcement of going to bring in this X amount number of international students. But there's such a structural issue related to that. I mean, you did talk about more programs being in English, and maybe maybe the South Korean example is different than Japan because there is a broader usage of English, I guess, in academia and elsewhere. But so. Does that, the realistic aspects of bringing in all those students perhaps is not achievable? I guess that's where I'm going.
I will say things have changed. So especially with COVID, I think the perception of South Korea as a very desirable study abroad destination has certainly increased. It was seen as one of the few safe places to still study abroad during the COVID pandemic, in large part because of the health measures that were taken there. Things like K-pop and the popularity of, Korean films and other things have certainly also, made it more popular to study abroad in South Korea. And I mean, even in the United States, clearly, I think everyone knows American students don't study abroad very much, but among the students who do, South Korea has also become much higher on students' radars. That South Korea is one of the fastest growing study abroad destinations for American students. And actually, among foreign languages that American students opt to learn in college, most have stayed flat or declined in popularity, with one exception. Korean language has been increasing in popularity for the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, that's really interesting. And the reason is?
Everything I just said. The popularity
Okay,
of
it's just because
K-pop and
they're looking to maybe go
yep,
to South Korea.
maybe BTS. Maybe BTS is the reason.
Okay. Well, so now I'm going to shift a little bit back to the homeland here in the U.S. And, one of the things too that I feel strong about, and you write about this, is that international students are seen as, particularly at the undergraduate level, but at the graduate level as well, as part of not just a money-making machine, but that they are also part of making our institutions more diverse. And, my general sense is that, I think we all kind of agreed some aspect of diversity is an important component of the educational experience of students. But it isn't just, a domestic discussion. It needs to be a global discussion of what we mean by diversity. And so why don't you just say a little bit about what is the value of having international students at the undergraduate level in your viewpoint?
I mean, as you say, it brings an important intercultural element to the student experience that doesn't just benefit international students only. It benefits all students, from California, domestically or otherwise. I strongly believe that when a university intentionally brings international students, whether it be for financial reasons or otherwise, it also has the responsibility to ensure that the students have the resources they need to succeed and excel within that campus environment. And so that means rather than expecting students to acculturate into the university, it's up to that university to then create the conditions for the success of those students, thus putting the onus not on the students, but on the university itself, because the university brought those students there in the first place. And so this is actually work that I've done more recently here at my home institution at Georgetown. We look a lot at, with this changing population of our own students, with an increasing population of international students, both on campus and also online. And I'm happy to talk about the future of international students in virtual education later. But, what is it that we need to do as higher education professionals to ensure that level of student success and make sure that learning opportunities and opportunities for the diversification of the student body do indeed happen?
Well, since you brought that up, what about the online virtual AI maze of the future? That's an interesting aspect. How will that affect South Korean international student mobility or others? What's your general observations on that?
Yeah. Well, if we look back to what has happened throughout the 2010s, and this is the period of which my book covers, we see universities creating these novel admissions pathways to enter that both allows international students to come for revenue purposes and appeases domestic backlash against them. So, for example, the community college transfer pipeline, it's a way for the UC system to still accept international students, or the California system as a whole to still accept international students because they have become much more welcome within community colleges. But of course, with increasing admissions quotas at the UC system, that is meant to sort of appease public backlash against the idea that international students are supposedly taking away seats from California students. So that's what we've seen in the last decade. Going forward, a lot has changed. I mean, when I finished the book in the middle of COVID, and so it was like, okay, well, wow, everything's going to be different. What I see happening post-COVID and looking forward is that universities will rethink who international students even are. The assumption a decade prior was that these are students who are young and mobile. Now, I think universities are looking at them as older and perhaps more settled, So we see the proliferation of online programs, adult education programs, continuing education programs that are targeting this very different demographic, and not just creating another novel pathway, but creating a student market that didn't necessarily exist before.
Yeah, there's been various initiatives by American universities to create global programs and all of that. And it seems like it's often the promise isn't quite played out, but maybe the world is changing now. And targeting those older students makes a lot more sense, because we generally know that 18 to 24-year-olds don't do really well in a virtual world in terms of completing courses and these kinds of things. So that's an interesting observation. I have a question from one of the on the chat function, and that is that it appears, and I think they're asking you whether this is true, that the Americanization of the liberal arts and these kinds of programs in South Korea among these institutions is still largely, it's an undergraduate phenomena and isn't really burbling into the graduate level programs. So that's a question to you.
Yeah, so by virtue of it being a liberal arts college, it is primarily focused at the undergraduate level within places like Yonsei and other South Korean universities. There are, all English taught programs, for example, at the graduate level, or internationalized graduate programs that primarily hire international faculty members recruited from overseas to teach them. So it's a different model at the graduate level. But yes, this sort of extreme version of American style liberal arts college, taught entirely in English, taught entirely by international faculty members recruited from overseas and plopped into the middle of a place like South Korea, that is primarily at the undergraduate level, but which is significant because it disrupts more traditional forms of undergraduate learning. For example, the model of having to declare a major before you even enter college, and you study in that one department of your major all 4 years, that's being disrupted by the transplanting of this kind of American style liberal arts model, where students enter into a general curriculum for 2 years before specializing in a particular major. So it has a lot of fundamental changes beyond just the language or whatnot in terms of actually shaping the way college education is structured.
Yeah, I guess I was also trying to segue, I didn't quite say it properly, into, well, what is the quality of graduate education in South Korea? And how does it feed into the labor market? I know that, at least in the Japanese example, getting a doctorate wasn't necessarily a benefit to get into the growth markets like tech and other sources, or just the normal industries that are the big players in Japan. Is the quality of the graduate education significant? Do people look to go there, and does it feed into the labor market?
Yeah, in South Korea specifically, and this is different perhaps than a place like Japan, for instance. Oftentimes, especially for the pursuit of a doctoral education, it was, and perhaps in some ways still is, more advantageous to do your doctoral degree overseas, predominantly in the United States. So, I mean, even if you look at, if you just even do a quick glance of faculty members in any given department at Yonsei even, you'll see many, if not most, have done their PhDs in the United States, even if they did their bachelor's degree within South Korea. So a large part of that is because of the demand for those who can teach in English, who can research and write in English. Because of these internationalization reforms happening, there has been some preference for U.S. university degree holders. And so all of that feeds in to this larger phenomenon of internationalization.
Okay, so I've got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll close up. One is, what what could American universities and a Berkeley or similar, because there's such a diversity of institutions, how to talk about this issue appropriately. But let's say at the research university level, what kind of things can they do to better by international students or to support them better?
Yeah, I touched on this in my earlier comments. Essentially, as I said earlier, I strongly believe that universities do have a responsibility to ensure that international students can succeed, especially if they've intentionally brought them there in the first place. And so how do you do that? It's a question that I grapple with. It's a question that many others grapple with. But ultimately, I think it comes down to centering the needs of the students rather than the needs of the university. And also centering the needs of the students across all stages of the student life cycle. So before arrival, questions to ask are international students getting the visa support they need? Are they able to successfully navigate the admissions process? And then, of course, during their stay on campus, do they have the academic resources? Are they able to find meaningful co-curricular activities? Are they able to participate in internships and so forth? And even after graduation, so can career services support their professional ambitions, especially students who look for jobs outside of the United States? Are there sufficient alumni engagement opportunities? So these are questions that I think higher ed professionals can engage with as they really think about, centering the needs of the students and thereby, meeting that responsibility of improving the international student experience.
So this isn't my second question, but it does make me think about all those students going to community colleges that can't really afford those kind of support structures. I mean, you noted at least examples, sometimes where whole, parts of the family come, this feeds into other issues related to immigration, but, they can't really afford, can they, to provide that kind of support structure? Or how do those students manage to get through that, go on their own or with their family members to a community college?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, you're asking, so how do community colleges, for example, which are, much less underfunded compared to, I don't know, a place like UC Berkeley, for example, how do they provide these support services? That's a tough question, right? I mean, regardless of what institution you're at, I think we're all facing, shrinking budgets. It's the story of higher ed for the last decade, at least. Nonetheless, I think that there can be ways to still do this. I mean, certainly, it looks very bad when, for example, a college has intentionally brought in international students for financial revenue generating reasons, but then cuts its programs for cost generating programs like international student clubs or things that don't actually generate a revenue. And then, of course, offer services like housing support or academic support, but also often offer them for an extra fee, these revenue generating programs. So, there are ways to do it, but also there are ways to do it in a way that, again, centers the students' needs as opposed to the needs of the institution.
Again, just a slight aside on that is that how much do South Korean students, you noted some aspects in the Jessica story in which she didn't want to identify with other South Korean students for various reasons, but do they network well? I mean, this has kind of been known about Chinese students and other parts of Asia, is that like they tend to still, especially if you have a critical mass, whatever that is, that they, support each other in some form in that transition of being an international student on a campus like Berkeley.
Yeah, I mean, funny thing about Jessica is I did a follow-up interview with her more recently, so years later after I met her at Berkeley. And I, during her follow-up interview, I just asked her to tell me about her post-college life. And, she actually spoke very fondly of her time at De Anza College, at a community college.
That was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, even though at the time I had first met her, she had downplayed the fact that she was a community college transfer student.
Yeah.
She lightly concealed it to her peers because it was a source of stigmatization. But looking back, she recounted how that was where she really learned the skills she now uses day to day in her professional life to become a confident, outgoing, ambitious young woman. And so I think that a lot of this stuff gets buried in the stigmatization. I think just reflecting on Jessica's story, that some of this stuff could be better sort of addressed and even touted by the various institutions, colleges, and universities themselves, as they market themselves not only as transfer pathways into a place like UC Berkeley, but also as places where students can learn the very valuable skills that will carry with them throughout a lifetime.
Okay, so final question. What are you working on now, research-wise? I did see a plug about being able to go to the East-West Center in Hawaii, which is not a bad place to go. So in any case, what are you up to in terms of your current research plans and writing?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for asking. So I've done a little bit of a 180 in my newer research. I've moved away from looking at international students and looking more at international funding, and looking at the organizational behavior of universities through the way they're funded by US governments. Specifically, I'm looking at how increasing xenophobia within the US government then affects the funding and the operations within US universities, and how that plays out in places like area studies funding, in what we study, how we study it, and how we navigate this this fraught political environment.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking the time. It's great to see you virtually.
Yeah,
We were
likewise.
talking before we saw each other in DC, but we couldn't even identify exactly when. It was pre-COVID. There's pre-COVID and after COVID as the new designation of different eras. So in any case, congratulations on the book, and encourage people to look online and buy it. It's a very nice read. It isn't, you can read it, which is important. And so again, appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so